we have a very unusual painting here. This is a painting that I think may be the most valued, most revolutionary painting that this museum actually has. It's actually one of the most unknown paintings, and I've done some digging over the summer, and I've come to find out that this may be the catalyst for some of the work that you're going to see here in a second. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but this is by an artist by the name of Janet Sobel, and Janet Sobel actually came over here from the Ukraine in 1893, and she came over right after her father died. Her father died in a riot in Russia, in the Ukraine actually, and they came over when they were 15. When I say they, it's her mother and two brothers. They came over and actually got married to a man by the name of Max, and she got married when she was about 17. She comes over to Ellis Island and she changes her name to Janet or Jenny Wilson at this time. Jenny Wilson we find out that her name is changed not because of, which is most cases, the boat that she actually traveled over on, but the British lines was called the Wilson lines of boats that came over. So as they came over, they were thinking about what name they should put on it, and they get it from the actual British line that they do. So they come over, they change her name at Ellis Island and land in New York. She's in Brooklyn for most of her life at the beginning. She gets married rather young at 17, and she actually has 4 sons. While she's doing this, she's growing up, and her mother becomes an invalid. She's been taking care of that a lot with her 4 sons. But as her sons start to grow up, her son Saul starts to take art classes. And she, at the age of 43, starts to use his art supplies. For the first time, starts to do that. Now, she starts to paint, and Saul is a big advocate of his mother's. So what happens is Saul begins to introduce her, the mother, Janet Sobel here, to a lot of the art critics around the world, or in New York at that point. For one, Marc Chagall. Marc Chagall comes over, and they spend a lot of times in the afternoons speaking Russian together and learning about the art and talking about it. Another one is Max Ernst and Peggy Guggenheim, 2 very important pieces in this one. Now, Max Ernst and Peggy Guggenheim get married at a time, and they become very significant in her work. She's considered a surrealist type at this level, and I want to kind of pass out a couple of things to you. First off, here is a picture of her and a guy named John Dewey. And John Dewey is a psychologist and an educator reformer, and he's got some very interesting things to say about her work that I'm going to be sharing with you in a little bit. And I want to give you some background on some of her work. Here's another one of her pieces, one of her earlier pieces. She does very simple imagery of people, and what we're starting to see is a development of style from her. So she gets married. Saul starts to take up her voice among the art world and starts to pass things around. In fact, he sends a letter to Mark Rothko, and then he gets in touch with Peggy Guggenheim, and they start to collaborate on things, and they're really falling in love with her work. It gets to the point where Peggy asks her to do a one-woman show in her galleries at the time. So she does this one-woman show, and this is in 1945. The judges for the show are Max Ernst, Michel Duchamp, Andre Breton, and Peggy Guggenheim. So there's some big wigs in this one. They start to see her work. John Dewey also comes, and I want to kind of tell you what he says about her work, because I think it's kind of an eye-opening perspective of the actual image that we're starting to see. Now remember, she has no formal art education, so she's learning this, and she's actually doing this artwork on the side, but she's getting some really good influences from a lot of people. And this is what John Dewey said, and John Dewey is a psychologist and educated reformist. He says, interblending of abundant life of vegetation with the sparser life of human beings. So we see this organic shapes coming to be, both with the human being form and the vegetation, this type of things. And you can also see the human forms come out in her pieces, almost peering like through bushes in a sense, as they look through that. But this is where it gets interesting. there was a rumor around this museum that Jackson Pollock and Janet Sobel actually shared a studio of some time. And that's what kind of got me interested in this and what connection these two had together. In fact, they did not share a studio together. So I'm going to give you some times and dates because this is pretty important. In 1945, she has a show with Peggy Guggenheim. In 1946, she has her own show. Does that, right? During the 1946 show, Jackson Pollock and Clement Greenberg come to the exhibition. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. What kind of influence does Janet Sobel have on Jackson Pollock and everything else? Was Jackson Pollock doing this type of work before he met this work in face-to-face? Now, we know that Jackson Pollock and Sequoia had some different ways of putting paint on the canvas. Max Ernst also had sprays and splatters and things that occurred, but nothing to this type of effect, nothing of this dripping, this continual dripping type form. Now here's a painting, or here's a picture of her actually working on the ground. This seems to be a very popular way to work if you're doing this type of things. You may also know another artist that works on the ground in these large images. So what happens now is they get influenced. Jackson Pollock and Clement Greenberg get influenced with this. And things start to get twisted here. 1946 is when Jackson Pollock sees her work for the first time. 1947, her biggest advocate is Peggy Guggenheim. Closes her galleries and moves to Europe. 1947, same year, they move out of New York, and they moved to New Jersey. Her husband is running a factory of costume jewelry, fake pearls and such like that. She leaves Europe. She does not know how to drive. She has not become a citizen at this point. She has trouble with the language. There's a lot of barriers that go in between them, but there's one very significant barrier. The very most important barrier that I've seen so far, and why she kind of dropped out of this art world for a while, she was allergic to oil paint. So she made a big splash in 1946 and 1947 and then disappears. She moves to New Jersey, nobody talks to her. One critic actually calls her up and says, "Can you talk about some of your work for a little bit?" And she says this to him: "I'm interested in people and everything that pertains to them." Leaves out the whole interest of art and her significance with that. And the art critic takes that as she is no longer an artist and dismisses her right away. And she continues to not be shown in New York until 2003. Disappears from this world. So this is what we do know. We know that Janet Sobel, and this is where it gets a little dicey, did Jackson Pollock steal this exact idea? Now, stealing in the art world is a very tricky world because we have influences and we have all sorts of kinds of connections. So I'm going to use that loosely, and I'm going to say he stole this because it looks like an exact copy, very different than some of the other things. Jackson Pollock starts to do work very, very similar to this, if not nearly identical, that you could not tell the difference between one of her works and one of his works. Clement Greenberg is one of the biggest advocates of this new style of painting, this American Expressionism. He gets on the Jackson Pollock bandwagon and starts to promote Jackson Pollock, not Janet Sobel. And at this point in history, 1946, 1947, is when things got skewed. And that's why I think that she could be one of the greatest artists that this museum ever has. Because this, I think, is the painting, one of the paintings in the collection that changed the art world and actually influenced one of the most collected painter, most valued painter that we know of. But she's not known, she's not credited with this work because of several different things. One, possibly gender. Two, language barrier from another country, right? Three, her movement from New York to New Jersey to the suburbs to work on the factory. And four, Peggy Guggenheim, her biggest advocate at this point, who's promoted her at all times, actually moves away to Europe. So in her life, what does she do? She paints in her house, but she has 4 sons, one of which was Saul, which was the biggest advocate of hers. But she takes care of that, and her husband, Max, dies at a relatively early age, 15 years after she left New York. She runs the business. She stays out of the artwork altogether, runs the factory for the rest of her life to live in total obscurity for what it has. But one of the reasons why I wanted to do this ArtStop was because I think she is such an unsung hero for the art world, and what kind of influence that she could possibly have, and the impact of this one very piece of its influence on the other world, and in particular Jackson Pollock. So that is it.